Greetings from my office in beautiful Canberra, Australia's national capital. My name's Lisa Robbins and I'm Principal of Robbins Consulting and one of AWP's many partner organisations. I'm an independent consultant and I've worked for 30 years in water and natural resource management as a researcher, a science communicator and facilitator, and a manager of programs and projects. I also wear a second hat as an honorary senior lecturer at the Australian National University's Fenner School of Environment and Society, where I did a PhD on NRM governance and capacity building. Apart from Australia, I've lived and worked internationally in the Greater Mekong region, Indonesia, the United Kingdom and Canada. This Kinney video clip you're watching has two distinct parts. In this part, I'll give you a bit more background on my engagement in the Indo-Pacific region, and after that I'll present some slides on approaches to strengthening water governance, which is one of my interest areas. The presentation draws mostly from a 2017 paper I co-authored, which was published in the international journal Environmental Science and Policy. So returning briefly to my work history in the Indo-Pacific, I was really fortunate to receive an Australian Government Executive Endeavour Award in 2010 to work in Vientiane with the Empower Network for a period of 3 months, which was just a fantastic experience. Empower, for those who aren't familiar with them, they're a network of action researchers, dialogue facilitators and knowledge brokers. So much of what I was involved with at that time has informed my subsequent work. Indeed, my relationship with Empower turned out to be much more enduring than that initial 3 months. Recently, I co-edited Empower's 5th and final book in its edited volume series, this one on water governance dynamics in the Mekong region, which was released at the 2016 Greater Mekong Forum on Water, Food and Energy. Back when my Empower Fellowship finished in early 2011, I was engaged by the Australian Centre for International Agricultural Research, better known as ACR, for 4 years as a knowledge broker and a coordinator for their rice-based systems research program, which had projects in Cambodia, Laos and Bangladesh. One of the highlights was organising a policy dialogue in Phnom Penh on rice futures at the end of the program. I edited a collection of short papers from that dialogue, which was published in this ACR proceedings. And the dialogue process, coupled with the proceedings, was widely thought to be a pretty successful outcome for ACR as well as for others in the region. More recently, I've worked with AWP as a synthesis writer for the 2017 Ayeyarwady State of the Basin Assessment, which was a really challenging exercise involving a multitude of actors and technical reports at different stages of completion. It was most certainly a team effort and there were smiles all around when the report was launched by the Myanmar's Vice President at the Asia Pacific Water Summit just before Christmas. Apart from the Greater Mekong region, Indonesia is my other main focus area. While working with ACR in the Mekong, I moved to Indonesia with my husband in 2012. For 2 years, we lived in the city of Bogor on the outskirts of Jakarta. And I've continued with Indonesian language studies since that time, including Skype classes with Shri, my guru, who's based in Denpasar. During that time, I also did some short-term project work for the Centre for International Forestry Research, including co-writing and editing the 2012 annual performance report for CGIAR research program number 6, Forestries and Agroforestry, as well as doing a few other synthesis and publishing related projects like these. I also work for DFAT's Indonesia-Australia Forest Carbon Partnership during its final year, most particularly involved in these sorts of reports, which were about identifying lessons learned for policy and for practice. On returning to Australia in mid-2014, I worked remotely with the Global Green Growth Institute to develop large-scale district-level project proposals on climate change mitigation and green growth interventions in central Kalimantan. Through the ANU, I've also contributed to DFAT's Indonesia Knowledge Sector initiative through writing clinics for mid-career academics, including some remote tutoring of participants to help them publish their research in international journals. At the moment, I'm participating in a long-term ACR project that's focused on improving community-based management of peat fires and peatland restoration and identifying associated sustainable land management practices and livelihoods. My involvement in the project is very much focused on knowledge management and stakeholder engagement. And stemming from another ACR project led by the University of the Sunshine Coast, I've written a journal paper on megatrends influencing change in Indonesia's economy and society and eliciting possible implications for the status of forestry for smallholders, which I'm hoping to get published sometime this year. Now I'll turn to the second part of this video clip and speak about strengthening water governance with lessons from Australia and the United Kingdom. My presentation will draw mostly from the paper Making Water Policy Work in the United Kingdom, a case study of practical approaches to strengthening complex multi-tiered systems of water governance. The paper arose from a 3-month sabbatical in 2016 at the University of Durham in northeast England, where I was visiting fellow at Hatfield College, which included convening a one-day deliberative dialogue on water sustainability with particular emphasis on integrated catchment management. My 4 co-authors are professors from the universities of Durham, Oxford and Dundee. In outlining the 10 propositions to you, I'll also provide a practical example for most from either Australia or the UK so as to make the point more tangible. It's worth noting that overlap exists between some of the ideas put forward, but that each point was deemed amongst my co-authors to be sufficiently distinctive to warrant separate discussion. The first of 10 propositions for improving and reinvigorating water policy in contexts characterised by complex, multi-layered arrangements for water governance is the need for an overarching policy to effectively and efficiently guide the use of water resources. The idea of putting in place some form of long-term water policy is to step back and take a systemic long-term view of water resource management and make sure that the national compass for water resource management is pointing in the right direction. It can provide a vehicle for articulating a much broader whole-of-nation vision for water management. And in doing so, it might be more clear how the raft of specific water-related projects, initiatives, plans and regulations fit together and where the important gaps and inefficiencies lie. By way of example, a simple form of such a policy might be a national charter for water, akin to the UK Woodland Trust's initiative shown here to define a charter for trees, woods and people. The charter sets out 10 high-level principles developed on the basis of extensive consultation with more than 70 partner organisations and 300 community groups, and was released in 2017 to mark the 800th anniversary of the 1217 Charter of the Forests. Community-based planning and management of water and other natural resources at river basin scale is a core feature of governance arrangements in many parts of the globe. In many countries, including the UK, the potential for catchment level thinking and action is yet to be fully exploited. The second proposition, therefore, is that river basin planning and management that is community-led and nested at appropriate scales should form the centrepiece of a nationwide water policy. Once devised and agreed, all relevant institutional arrangements need to be aligned to fit with this overarching water policy and complementary river basin plans, not vice versa. This will necessitate a serious structural and even cultural shift to catchment level thinking and action, including internal arrangements for planning, works programs, budgeting and reporting. The justification for water-related initiatives and activities proposed by any actors or entities, whether public or private, should demonstrate alignment with the relevant scale basin plan. This map shows Australia's 56 formally designated natural resource management or NRM regions across its 6 states, which are equivalent to provinces, and its 2 territories. All of these regions are confined within the boundaries of their parent state or territory, and many are delineated by catchment boundaries where it makes sense to do so. Each of these 56 regions has its own regional NRM organisation, which is governed by a community-based board of management. These organisations have diverse histories and contexts. They have been progressively devolved responsibilities for NRM planning and implementation from both federal and state or territory levels of government. Their primary emphasis is on sustainable land and water management, and this is reflected in the predominance of farmers on those governing boards in rural settings. The federal government has increasingly used tide funds to drive their agendas. These funds aim to tackle land and water issues of national importance, such as water quality, soil and water salinisation, soil erosion, and the like. Over time, federal government funding has shifted from being directed to local level groups for small-scale projects to these regional level organisations for targeted, larger scale projects based on agreed regional strategic plans. The third proposition is that river basin planning and management must be properly resourced. If long-term planning and sustainable management of water resources is to be done seriously, then it requires secure streams of funding commensurate to the task. The UK government has adopted the so-called catchment-based approach, or CABA policy, which sounds fine in theory, but for which the funding provision is paltry in absolute terms and provides no certainty for forming lasting collaborative partnerships and related institutional structures. For the 2013-14 financial year, the sum of £1.6 million was provided as start-up funding to establish catchment partnerships, of which £0.2 million was for training support and up to £0.4 million for investment as seen fit by a national level steering group. Of the remaining £1 million, each catchment partnership, which comprised 25 pilots and 37 locally organised initiatives, received only about £15,000 each. To put this in perspective, Australia's 56 regional NRM organisations were each allocated base level funds of $5.25 million Australian dollars in the 2009-2010 financial year, totalling almost 300 million Australian dollars. That's equivalent to about 170 million pounds. So that's a massive 202-fold difference compared to the UK arrangements, without accounting for the 4-year difference in the funding timeframe. In addition, Australia's 56 regional NRM organisations source significant funds from a range of entities and programs beyond these start-up resources from the federal government. The fourth proposition is to refocus the policy framing, because how a water or any other policy is framed matters greatly. To quote from Entman 1993, frame means to define problems, diagnose causes, make moral judgments, and suggest remedies. On that basis, who gets to frame a whole of nation water policy or a river basin management plan at different scales is paramount, as the result has potential to greatly be swayed by differing worldviews, dominant paradigms, vested interests, and unequal power relations. Here's an advertisement in October 2017 calling for applications for 25 positions on the governing boards of 8 regional NRM organisations in the state of South Australia. In this state, as in most other jurisdictions in Australia, the approval of board members requires the approval of the responsible minister, so regional NRM organisations across the country are not independent of political interference. When new governments are elected, it's not unusual for the chairs of NRM boards, if not entire committees, to be replaced by appointees aligned with the prevailing government's ideology. Proposition 5 contends that formulating a system-wide water policy that is both progressive and long-lasting requires access to the best available data and information. If a diversity of stakeholder interests is to participate effectively in water policy, it is incumbent on governments to free up access to data and information and to make concerted efforts to enable collection and utilisation of best available science and local knowledge. This will require government agencies to explore what constitutes evidence and how to incorporate local site-specific knowledge to co-produce shared understandings of the environment, as well as to engage more actively and openly with academic and research institutions. The Australian Geoscience Data Cube is a good example of efforts by government to make data more readily available. The Data Cube comprises more than 3 decades of satellite imagery spanning Australia's total land area at a resolution of 25 square metres, and has been used to map observations of surface water for all of Australia between 1998 and 2012 at that resolution. Simply providing best available information, however, is not enough. Proposition 6 contends that structured fora and processes are needed that enable open, honest and wide-ranging conversations amongst the multiplicity of actors and their competing interests. Such conversations will yield more meaningful results when those who participate have a high level of water literacy. A more water literate society will better enable water managers to shift from reactionary crisis-driven approaches to long-term agenda-driven plans in line with agreed strategic goals. Environment Links UK is a good example of a forum and a conduit for networking amongst organisations with an interest in the environment. It comprises 4 link organisations from each of England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, which regularly exchange information and meet to discuss priorities and best practice. The links also campaign together on issues of common interest under the name Environment Links UK. Taken together, Environment Links UK members have the support of over 8 million people in the UK and manage over 750,000 hectares of land. Everyone has a stake in how water resources are managed and needs to be engaged through active participation and collaborative effort. Proposition 7 therefore emphasises the need to mobilise people. In the UK, citizen science approaches to collecting, processing and sharing data and information are quite developed in fields like wildlife surveys, but examples in aspects of water science are much more limited. Australia, on the other hand, has some long-term success stories, like Waterwatch. Waterwatch programs support communities to monitor the health of waterways, to learn through environmental education, and to participate in projects to protect, rehabilitate or restore the health of waterways. More recently, in 2014, the Australian Citizen Science Association was formed, quote, to advance citizen science through the sharing of knowledge, collaboration, capacity building and advocacy. It is a member-based community that supports, informs and develops citizen science. Membership is open to citizen science project managers, volunteers or anyone with an interest in citizen science. The 8th proposition contends that core community networks need to be supported and sustained. Embedding a nested approach to river basin planning and management that is community-led should build upon existing networks of community-based organisations with strong connections to water issues. The UK has an existing network of more than 70 catchment-based river trusts or equivalent entities. However, they vary greatly in capacity and in the types and levels of activity in which they are engaged. Some employ staff, tap into a variety of funding sources and are highly active, while others are without paid employees and only able to engage in a narrow range of activities. As such, the network of Rivers Trusts isn't firmly embedded and genuinely empowered in current institutional structures, including financially. In the case of Australia's network of 56 designated regional NRM organisations, you can see that there are significant differences both within and between jurisdictions, amongst other things, in the size of the area and population they serve, in their corporate form, and in the number of employees and board members. This reflects, amongst other things, their different histories and socio-political settings. I note that these figures are somewhat out of date, but they nevertheless paint an accurate enough picture for our purposes. Although diverse, these organisations represented a far more recognisable and persistent set of institutional and management entities than existed previously at the regional scale in Australian land and water management. Proposition 9 contends that good legislative foundations, backed up by effective systems of monitoring and enforcement, are critical to successful integrated catchment management. In recent months in Australia, there's been great controversy with respect to water management in the Murray-Darling Basin, a catchment which occupies 10% of the continent and is Australia's main breadbasket. There is community uproar further to alleged large-scale water theft by irrigators in the northern part of the Murray-Darling Basin, together with alleged collusion by some state bureaucrats at the expense of environmental water flows to the river and to southern communities and environments. In response, the Government of South Australia has launched a Royal Commission of Inquiry. This rift has put monitoring and evaluation procedures and enforcement fair and square in the public and political spotlight. Finally, Proposition 10 gives attention to the need to address systemic institutional amnesia. For water institutions to be effective, they need smart and dedicated people and the corporate memory that they embody. In both Australia and the UK, water governance suffers greatly from systemic amnesia, as people move from job to job, including within individual organisations, often in response to short-term contractual arrangements. The 1 to 3 year duration of most projects creates a significant barrier to long-term thinking and action. In the field, the churn of local knowledge keepers translates to dwindling memory of existing data and past events and tenuous local relationships and networks. For successful integrated catchment management, strident efforts are needed to plug these knowledge leaks across the whole system. In this presentation, 10 propositions have been advanced for improving and reinvigorating water policy in contexts characterised by complex, multi-layered arrangements for water governance, with some practical examples in the cases of Australia and the United Kingdom. In selecting these examples, I have made a point of presenting both best practice and bad practice, and in doing so, of conveying a more general message that sustainable water management is perhaps best viewed as a journey more so than a utopian destination, and that the degree of success of any such journey will depend greatly on the scope for enacting continuous improvements informed by sharing and learning amongst the diversity of system actors. For those interested in learning more about Australia's devolved arrangements for natural resource management, these 2 articles are a good starting point. Thank you.